Welcome to this channel, which is a class on research methods by Dr. Lydia Wabugu. This is a class where we discuss everything social science research, from understanding the research discipline, research philosophy, the elements of scientific research, and the methodologies of conducting research. Feel free to ask any question regarding today's lesson on the comment section. Welcome. Welcome to this lesson where we will be discussing threats to experimental designs. In our previous lesson, we have discussed experimental designs. We have said that experimental designs are the only designs that establishes causality, meaning X causes Y. For you to be sure that X causes Y, we have said that all extraneous variables and spurious correlations should be avoided. We are saying that anything that should threaten the confidence of a researcher to conclude that X causes Y should be avoided. Our lesson today will be discussing the threats that may weaken this confidence of the researcher to conclude that X causes Y. These are the ones that are called threats to validity of experimental design. Before then, let us look at the learning outcomes of this lesson. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to differentiate between internal and external validity as applied in experimental design. Number two, discuss factors that threatens internal and external validity of an experimental design. And three, explain ways of minimizing threats to internal and external validity. As we begin, I want you to note that the validity we are talking about today is not the one that appertains to research instruments, but it is the one that pertains to experimental design. And we have introduced by saying we are discussing this validity so that the researcher is confident when he says or she says that X causes Y. So let's move together. We remind ourselves that experimental procedures or designs that we have discussed are the only designs, and therefore very unique, that allows the researcher to conclude that X causes Y. For you to be 100% confident that X causes Y, and when I say 100, I'm now talking like a layman. She or he must be sure that there are no spurious relationships and all extraneous variables have been controlled. If this confidence is threatened, then we threaten the validity of that experimental procedure. So threats are the factors that threatens the confidence of a researcher to conclude that X causes Y. We have two types of threats. There is threats to internal validity of the experimental design, and two, we have threats to external validity of the experimental design. Internal and external validity are concepts that reflect whether or not the results of an experimental study are trustworthy and they are meaningful. So it is the responsibility of the researcher to minimize potential threats to internal and external validity of the experimental design. So let us first understand what is internal validity before we look at threats to internal validity. Internal validity is the extent to which a study establishes a trustworthy cause and effect relationship between IV and DV. In other words, between treatment variable and outcome variable. This means that internal validity measures the confidence of a researcher to tell us that it is because of this experimental treatment or procedure that caused the observed change in the dependent variable. In other words, we are saying internal validity measures how confident the researcher is to conclude that the experimental treatment was the sole cause of the observed changes in the dependent variable. So any factor that threatens this confidence is called a threat to internal validity. Let's give an example. If you implement a behavior change program within a group of youths, how sure are you that any improvement in behavior seen among the youth is due to the treatment or it's due to your program that you have administered? There are likely to be many other explanations that may have brought in the change in behavior, including your program. So if you cannot be sure that it is your treatment that brought in the change, then that experimental procedure is threatened and its internal validity that has been threatened. That's why we are saying internal validity depends largely on the procedures of a study and how rigorous it is performed. Let us look at a table that summarizes threats to internal validity and the action that you need to take as a researcher to minimize the threats. The first type of threat is called history. Now, history is any event that is not part of the experiment that occurs in the environment at the same time that the experimental group is being exposed to the treatment, and this affects the performance of the dependent variable. Using the example of behavior change program, history would be any other event that the youth may be going through that is not part of your program that is likely to also change behavior. For instance, some may go for counseling, some may be watching programs on behavior change, others would be having their parents talk to them about behavior change, others could be the church that is talking to them on behavior change. All these are events besides your behavior program that are likely to bring about a change in the behavior of your youth. So unless you control for all those other events, then history is a threat to internal validity. So how can you remove this threat? You remove the threat by having both the experimental and the control group experience the same external events, and you also eliminate extraneous variables as much as possible. Another type of threat is testing. Remember, in experimental design, we have pre-test and post-test, and they are normally the same or highly equivalent. So testing means that participants become familiar with the outcome measure and remember responses for later testing. That means your participants, they become familiar with the pre-test, and therefore their post-test results become better than the pre-test. So what can you do as a researcher? You can have a longer time interval between when you administer the pre-test and when you administer the post-test, and also ensure that they are equivalent as possible. Or you can even eliminate pre-test altogether. We have discussed design where you do not have a pre-test. It's only called a post-test only design. Number 3 is machination. Machination is another threat, and we are saying that this means participants in the experimental, they may mature or change during the experiment. Maturity influences the results of an experimental design, and this may be physical or psychological development. When a person changes, then they are likely to influence the results of an experiment. So how can you take care of this threat? You can take care of it by selecting participants who mature or change at the same rate. You can also reduce the time gap between pre-test and post-test so that the participants will not have matured or changed rapidly. Another threat is instrumentation. This means changes in the pre- and post-test that impacts on the scores of the outcome. How can a researcher take care of this threat? They take care of it by using the same instrument for pre- and post-test. So ensure that the instruments are as identical as possible. Another threat is selection bias. This is where the researcher has selected participants who have certain characteristics that predisposes them to have certain outcomes. Imagine selecting only brighter students in the experimental group and less bright students in the control. That will definitely interfere with the results of the experiment. What can you do to respond to this threat? Ensure that you select participants randomly that are as equivalent as possible. Another threat is experimental mortality, meaning that participants drop out during the experiment. And because this will bring differences in experimental and control group, it therefore means that internal validity will be affected. What action can the researcher take? The researcher can recruit a large sample to account for dropouts. Remember, we said ideally the groups should have not less than 40 members. Another threat is statistical regression. This is similar to selection bias, where participants with extreme scores are selected for the experiment. Definitely, they will affect the outcome. So how can you address this threat? Ensure that you select participants who do not have extreme scores as entering characteristics for the experiment. The other threat is diffusion of treatment or interaction among variables. This is where participants in the control and experimental groups communicate with each other. This communication can influence how both groups score on the outcome. What can the researcher do? The researcher can keep the two groups as separate as possible during the period the experiment is being carried out. And he or she should make sure that the groups do not know who is in the control and who is in the experimental group. Number 9, compensation or recentive demoralization. This threat means that the benefits of an experiment may be unequal or may be resented when only the experimental groups receives the treatment. Meaning that when only the experimental group receives the treatment, the control may resent and may drop out of the experiment. So what action can the researcher do? The researcher can provide benefits to the two groups, such as giving the control group treatment after the experiment is over, or giving them something that is close to the treatment during the experiment. This is referred to as placebo treatment. Lastly, the last threat is compensatory rivalry. This is where participants in the control group feel that they are being devalued as compared to the experimental group because they are not receiving the treatment. What action can the researcher take? The researcher can create equality between the two groups by random selection and random assignment. He can also ensure that none of them knows that they are in the control or in the experimental group. This is called double blindness. We now move to external validity. External validity refers to how well the outcome of an experimental study can be applied to other settings. In other words, this type of validity refers to how generalizable are the findings of an experimental study. We are asking ourselves, can the findings of this experiment study apply to other people, other settings, other situations and time periods? To what extent are the results applicable beyond the experimental setting? Are we confident that we can generalize the findings of an experimental study beyond the experimental setting? Again, we have a table that summarizes threats to external validity. One of them is interaction effects of selection or bias selection. This is where you do not select and assign your sample randomly. So what can you do? You may restrict your claim about the experiment to the group that you have conducted the experiment with, or alternatively, you conduct additional experiments with groups which have got different characteristics. Another one that is similar to the first one is interaction of setting and treatment. Because of selecting participants with a particular characteristic, a researcher cannot generalize beyond that experimental setting. Again, the action that the researcher can take is to conduct additional experiments in new settings to see if the same results occur as in the initial setting. Another threat is interaction of history and treatment. We have explained what history means under internal validity. So because results of an experiment are time-bound, they are only applicable within a certain period of time, a researcher cannot generalize the results to past or future situations. So what action can the researcher do? The researcher needs to replicate the study at a later time to determine if the results occur as in the earlier time. We have other threats to external validity. Number 4 is reactive effects of testing. This is where pre-test may alert the respondents on the nature of treatment, which in turn influences how they perform during post-test. So the post-test outcome then may not be a basis for generalizing, because already they were aware of the post-test from the pre-test. The other one is experimental effects or Pythagorean effect. This means the researcher's expectation of a certain result may affect the way he or she manipulates treatment. You see, the researcher really wants to see the change. Hence, they interfere with the outcome of such experiment, and in that case, such results may not be generalizable at all. Another one is called the Hawthorne effect or reactive effects of experimental arrangement. This occurs if the respondents come to know that they are either in the experimental or control group. In that case, the respondents tend to exhibit artificial behaviors that may affect the outcome of the experiment, thus hindering the generalization of the results. How would we minimize these threats? The first one is randomization. The second one is maintain the principle of double-blindness. You should not know, and they should also not know, who is in the experimental and who is in the control group. Number 3, the researcher should be as neutral as possible. The researcher should not be anticipating or so keen to see a change that he or she causes the groups to behave in an artificial manner that will threaten the outcome. The other one is prolong the time between multiple treatments. Remember, we have said sometimes post-test scores may improve based on the time between the pre-test and the post-test. And lastly, use placebo groups. This is where the control group is given something similar to what the experimental group is being given, so that they do not feel less valued in this whole procedure. With that, we have come to the end of today's lesson. Today we have discussed threats to internal and external validity of experimental design. Why have we discussed these threats? It is because experimental designs are unique, since they are the only ones that establishes causality. It is therefore imperative that the researcher is confident that the outcome of the experiment was the sole cause of the change that we have seen, and that the results of the experiment can be applied beyond the experimental setting. So if those two cannot be ascertained, then we have threats to internal and external validity respectively. Thank you for being part of this class today. I want to believe that the class was helpful. Feel free to put any question that you have on experimental designs and threats to experimental design on the comment section. Feel free to share this lesson with your friends. If you'd like to attend more lessons like today's, please subscribe to this channel. Until the next lesson, where we shall be discussing qualitative research designs, it is bye for now. Thank you.